Hello, this is Jeff Hamrick at Rhodes College again, and we're going to finish up our discussion of how we use a randomization procedure to analyze the results of our Coke versus Pepsi taste test. So let's recall what the experimental setup was here. I'm going to focus on the results from Professor Dunwell's class just for sake of specificity. Professor Dunwell had her students analyze 24 triplets of Coke and Pepsi. The triplets had either 2 samples of Coke and 1 sample of Pepsi, or 2 samples of Pepsi and 1 sample of Coke, and students who sampled the soda in the triplets were asked to identify the odd man out in each triplet. Okay? And let's recall the purpose of setting up this table and defining in this table a formula with a random function in it. Namely, our purpose in doing this was to simulate a universe in which Professor Dunwell conducts her analysis with 24 triplets again, but this time we conduct that analysis under the assumption that students cannot distinguish Coke from Pepsi, and that they therefore have to choose the odd man out completely at random. Okay? Students behaving in such a way will have only a 1/3 chance of picking the odd man out correctly. Okay? That's why in our formula that we created right here, we use this threshold of 1/3. Okay? Now what we'd like to do is actually to define a measure on this table that we've created, on this collection that we ourselves have created, so that that process will facilitate a randomization-based procedure. Okay, so to do so, we're going to double-click on our collection box and go to the Measures tab and define a measure. Not surprisingly, the variable of interest here we might call count of correct. We want to know when we simulate the behavior of Professor Dunwell's students under the assumption that they can't distinguish Coke from Pepsi, what is the count of those results that are equal to correct? So the formula is going to be pretty clear given what we've been doing this semester. We're going to count those instances of the attribute result that are equal to correct. Okay. So notice that in this particular batch we have 7 correct, and that matches the results from this summary table that I've created over here. Okay? Collecting one measure is never satisfying for us since we want to work with a randomization distribution for our analysis, so I'm going to collect many measures. All right, as usual, Fathom defaults to collecting 5 measures for us. I'm going to shut the animation off and collect a larger number of measures, maybe not too many, maybe just 50. Okay, that's pretty fast in Fathom. Let's take a look at what we have. So what we have here are 55 cases, the first 5 that were created by default plus 50 more that I added, 55 simulations of the analysis of 24 triplets of Coke and Pepsi under the assumption that Professor Dunwell's students can't distinguish Coke from Pepsi. So 55 is probably not enough to satisfy us, so I'm going to go on ahead and replace the existing cases and work with a fairly large number, 2,000. This is pretty fast in Fathom, unlike sampling without replacement. So if we wait just 1 second, we'll have our randomization distribution available to us. Notice that the table now doesn't have 55 instances of the simulation, it has 2,000 instances of the simulation. And I'm going to do what we always do, namely I'm going to create a graph and drag the measure over into the graph. And notice that the measure has an approximately Gaussian distribution, which has been occurring frequently throughout this class. Okay? It's not actually a Gaussian distribution, it's actually a binomial distribution, but we'll talk about that a little bit later this semester. Let's plot the value that we observed in Professor Dunwell's class originally. Professor Dunwell, her 24 triplets, 16 of them were analyzed correctly. That is, 16 students out of 24 during this one particular experimental run were able to distinguish the odd man out in the triplet that they were working on. And we see that this value we plotted is deep in the right tail of this randomization distribution, suggesting that we have evidence that Professor Dunwell's students can distinguish Coke from Pepsi. I'm going to define the empirical p-value in the usual way, namely it's going to be the count of the corrects that are greater than what we observed in Professor Dunwell's actual experiment divided by the total count of correct. And indeed, this empirical p-value is consistent with the conclusion that what we saw in Professor Dunwell's class is not due to random chance. They do seem to be able to distinguish Coke from Pepsi.